Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome to the conclusatory episode of Vatican II in a Year. I don't know what to call this, the kind of extra bonus episode. So it's episode 366, if you want to do it that way. This is your podcast host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Lead Chairs of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today, we're just going to go through your questions and comments, and there's a few notes from me on this. So first of all, we're going to have 8 questions. The last 2 are more just comments thanking the podcast, and then I'll do a little bit of review, and then just a final conclusion of like, hey, donate to the StarQuest and donate to my own community. This episode is not the best to listen to first. If you want to do that, go back to some of the earlier episodes or go to sqpn.com/Vatican and frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. So I had 6 questions or 6 replies with questions and then 2 with thank you. So the first one is from Justin, JAS84173 on Discord. And here let's just read his and then I'll give some commentary, some replies. I'm a Catholic who attends the Extraordinary Forum. I must thank you for this excellent podcast. It has cleared up some points of confusion I had. The only thing I'd say is I don't think you need to emphasize what the term man means in the document so much. Most people are aware that it's referring to mankind. I know the confusion comes from there being no distinguishing term like in Latin with homo and ver. He says ver, but it's ver. But I think man just refers to humans in general, and I doubt anyone would think differently. Once again, thank you for the show. Also, I'm originally from Connecticut, Diocese of Norwich. Something that is interesting is that it is one of the few dioceses which there are present in 2 states, being that it comprises also of Fisher's Island, New York. I thought I'd point that out because in a previous episode a while back, you were talking about a couple of dioceses that go beyond state lines in passing. Thanks for the podcast. I really appreciate it. And genuinely thank you for the hard work to have put into it. Well, thank you for your comment, Justin. So first of all, I actually had found out about Fisher's Island a little bit before this. I think it might have been after I recorded that episode. About halfway through the year, I switched to seminary I was teaching at. This year, I've been teaching out at St. Patrick's in the San Francisco Archdiocese. And now I'm teaching Holy Apostles in the Norwich Diocese in Connecticut. And I had found that out around the time I switched or soon after I switched, looking up the diocese and all the details on places like Wikipedia. And Norwich is one of 3 or 4, depending on how you define things. The Diocese of Wilmington, Delaware also includes the Eastern Shore, that's the other side of the Chesapeake Bay from Baltimore and D.C. And Gallup is the Navajo areas in Arizona and New Mexico. And then I said, 3 or 4 because do count D.C. as a state because obviously the Archdiocese of Washington has all of D.C. and part of Maryland. The others are visible on a map. Fisher Island is not. Fisher Island is a 5 square mile island just off of Connecticut near the Connecticut-Rhode Island border. But for historical reasons I'm not 100% sure of, it is part of New York State. It has about 400 people, and the regular ferry service is to New London, Connecticut, so it makes sense to make these people part of that parish, that diocese. You also note the idea of using the term man and explaining that they mean people or humans. That's fine. If you go into the Discord server, sqpn.com/Discord, and look at Vatican II in a Year, there's a whole commentary back and forth with me and several other users about this use and debating how we should use it, when we should use it. I don't know what I would do on my own. I'm just reading the documents as they're translated by the Vatican because that's who I have the rights to use. There are other translations of Vatican II documents out there in English, but I have the rights from the Vatican, from their version. So, our second question, J.A. Bellinger on Discord. He asks, or she asks, some other ideas on how we, as a laity, can encourage greater understanding about the documents, beyond just encouraging people to listen to your post. What has been some of the developments on fertility treatments since the council, particularly in matters of IVF? So I think Bellinger is asking two questions. First of all, how do we be more aware of the council? I think a lot has to do with kind of the normal interaction you have in a parish or things like that. First of all, I think there are times that it's very appropriate to bring in points from the documents in homilies and mention they come from Vatican II. That's very helpful. Now, obviously, I think the majority of our audience is not priests or not going to be or deacons. They're not going to be preaching homilies. So, what about lay people? And I think there are a lot of times when you're discussing things in the church, parish festivals, discussing news, where you can bring up something of, oh, did you know that this document in Vatican II says this is relevant to what we're talking about? I think that those kind of points are often where you can help people out. And if they hear all of a sudden 3, 4, 5 times, hey, these documents of Vatican II, then they might want to read them. Now, talking about fertility and things like that, how that's developed. Well, obviously, IVF, in vitro fertilization, just the first humans were the first human was in 1978. So obviously, that's a newer thing. There's also been other developments. I think we have to pray for some of these developments because right now we're on the cusp of possibly doing gene editing babies, and there is even more genetic screening that is eugenic. That's a problem. So just to be aware of those kind of things. This isn't the podcast to go into it. If I did another podcast and it was a bioethics podcast, we could spend a whole episode, 45 minutes on different things like that. And there's also been development in better tracking of women's cycles, different ways to better judge when a woman's cycle is, especially for women who have irregular periods. The method back in the day was the rhythm method, which is, better than nothing, but it's not nearly as effective today, and it's not really taught by anybody, at least in Canada and the US today. They use methods which are better, which were often developed after Humanae Vitae in 68. I don't remember the exact years. I'd have to go back and check them. One of the things talking to Catholic women in the last few years that has been most helpful is, I think it's called Clear Blue. They have a pee on the stick one where you can just have a little thing you put on each day that you pee on, and that changes color based on your hormones. And that is a very accurate measurement of your hormones, whereas other methods you have to rely on the how viscous the mucus is and your body temperature when you first get up before your kids jump on the bed and start attacking you or whatever. Depending on the mom, sometimes there is no time before that. Some kids are a little rambunctious. And so that's important. Moving on to question 3. William, the Old West Outlaw and X, asked the following. Why does the church talk constantly about immigration, yet never once about how immigration has destroyed citizens' communities, lowered their wages, destroyed their cultural identity, raised their taxes, rose crime, etc.? Why is the church silent on the plight of the citizen? I don't think the church is silent on this plight that William is pointing out. I think the reality is that very often the ones who are most mistreated are the immigrants. And so there is that aspect that there's been more injustice against them. So they're the ones the church calls out injustice against more. And sometimes we see even crimes that are very much exaggerated on these. There was the whole situation that got into the last election. They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, which was basically proven to be 100% false. There was no evidence of even one pet being eaten in that city it was claimed to be eaten in, let alone kind of a widespread, hey, we're eating all the cats and dogs in town. I should say one pet in the sense of a cat or dog. There are people who raise rabbits or guinea pigs, and part of why they raise them as a hobby is to eat them. That's a whole other aspect that, can be different. And I think there's also the aspect, in William's point, is that the church has often talked extensively about need for immigration to integrate into their new country. I think the people complaining here, like the situation he's talking about, are often immigrants who aren't integrating, who aren't doing that. Very few people are going to complain about the immigrant who runs the restaurant in the town that serves his, Mexican or Chinese food, and everybody in town likes, or most people like at least, or run a nail salon or a party store or a little small business like this. And I think a lot of this, at least in the more recent thing, is the kind of different aspects of society where you have high or low trust. And a lot of richer countries have been high trust societies, and so they assume people are doing the good. And then when these people come from low trust societies, sometimes they have this attitude that are, try and game the system, corrupt the system, which the high trust societies assume people won't. And so we have to look at how to integrate these people into high trust societies, because obviously a high trust society is ideal, and we shouldn't just give that up to help these people immigrate, because people do have a right to immigrate. That is an important thing. There can be limits for obvious reasons. There's not just, hey, we got to let in everyone, but there's a general right to immigrate in the church. Not going too far into that, but hopefully that's a brief summary. Question 4, someone asked me anonymously, when you report the number of bishops that vote for each document, is it possible to know who voted for what? Just wondered if the same few consistently voted no. I know I could find this if I really wanted to research, but in a quick search of a few, 10 minutes trying to find this, I couldn't find the lists. I know they'll exist somewhere. If I had like a day or two, I could do it. I'm sure I could find it. If somebody else wants to find it, great. I don't know if it was the same bishops always voting no, but I suspect it was. Otherwise, in all the readings I've had about it, kind of the secondary documents, not the documents of Vatican II itself, but discussions, would point out there were like these 3 bishops who always voted no. That's just my suspicion, though I don't have proof. Question 5, we're going back to Justin on Discord. He had some follow-ups. So let's read Justin. Here's a few follow-ups, so let's just read it. It's a little much. I have a question. If in Sacrosanctum Concilium states, it states that Latin is to be retained and also the laity should be able to sing the ordinary of the Mass in Latin, how was this interpreted as 99% of parishes seldom, if never, using Latin? If Gregorian chant has pride of place, why is it rarely used at Mass? I could think it could be argued that the current church authorities ignore this teaching of the Council, and thus the constitutional liturgy has never been properly implemented. Father Matthew, this podcast has been wonderful, and I've learned so much about the Council. Would you say it is fair that though the Council used ambiguous language in documents, with the most controversial aspects to it for traditional Catholics, which would be misrepresented by the quote-unquote spirit of Vatican II agenda? Was this always the end goal? How do we go back to the text of the Council and disregard the awful interpretations of the 60s and 70s? And lastly, is the acceptance of the Council something that the Church has always struggled with in implementation? Was there a pushback that followed the Council of Trent and the First Vatican Council, as well like we see following the Second Vatican Council? Thanks, and God bless. So I see at least 3 questions in here, and we'll take them in turn. First, Justin is asking about Latin in Mass. I would contest this 99% parishes seldom, if never, using Latin. Not that I think it's like 80%, way lower, but I do think there is a majority who never use Latin, but there's more than 1% who do things like sing the Our Father in Latin, sing the Sanctus, sing the Gloria in Latin. Some sing just the Kyrie, which is technically Greek, even though it's from the Latin Mass, things like that. And I think that's a good place to start. Honestly, if I was in charge of a parish, I would encourage that kind of singing of the Latin because of the universality. I do get the idea that we have the readings in English, for understanding, but we know the Mass. We don't need to have it in English as much. Whereas, like the readings, I don't remember every reading, and my Latin is, good enough if I put effort into it. But just kind of ordinary listening, I'm not going to get the reading in Latin unless I'm really, really paying attention and trying to parse it and things like that. And I have good Latin. Like, I had to have qualified Latin to get my doctoral degree and things like that. And so I expect I have much better Latin than the average prisoner, whereas I think the average person could understand, if we sang the Sanctus in Latin, which is the Holy, 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 and that was sung in Latin and just learned it every week. Second, Justin here is asking about ambiguous texts. I don't think the ambiguity is the main issue. In, 15-ish years ago, there was a big dialogue between the SSPX and the Vatican under Benedict XVI. And it looked like the SSPX was close to re-entering in full communion. But they rejected the council, and this was even with Benedict offering the kind of clarity on these documents to make sure that was as acceptable as could be for them. I'm not saying there's no texts that aren't ambiguous. There are ambiguous texts. That's true. But it's less than I think a lot of people think, and it's not as ambiguous as they think, especially if you know the context. Sometimes if you take the one line out of context, it seems ambiguous, but put it back into context, it's much less ambiguous. Now, Justin rightly notes what I call the quote-unquote spirit of Vatican II, and he also calls it that. I think that honestly, in the 60s and 70s, they just sucked the air out of the room so that the hermeneutic of continuity reading, which was what I would call this podcast to myself, it was not able to get a fair hearing. This is a problem. And I think this spirit of Vatican II is who's to blame for this quote-unquote ambiguity. So I would really push back for there to find out who is, those type of things. And how do we avoid it? Well, I think things like this podcast, things like people reading it, things like actually going back to the text when you have claims. One of the things I have done, and I would continue to do, but I'm not sure if everyone else who was maybe not as aware would do, is to say, if somebody says, oh, Vatican II says this, okay, show me the paragraph. Show me where it says that in the document. And I get that most of you probably don't know, hey, where's the other thing, the opposite interpretation of the document, or something like that, whereas I often do know that. The last thing for Justin here is pushback after councils. There have been some councils with a lot of pushback afterwards. Arianism reached its peak after Nicaea, after it was condemned. There was the Old Catholic split after Vatican I. The Old Catholic's now a liberal Protestant denomination with Catholic aesthetics, basically. And I think that there can be a lot of pushback. I think that there is less direct pushback than more of kind of an intentional misinterpretation by the quote-unquote spirit of Vatican II. Even though in online discourse, in Catholic circles, in discussions and online, the kind of Latin Mass, trad Catholic is quite large, in actual population, I don't think it's a huge portion. I think the spirit of Vatican II Catholics were a much larger portion of going astray. So, let's move on to question 6, the last real question. Greg on X just said, maybe something on Madonna House. So, this is a little bit outside this podcast, but I want to mention it. In the past 18 or so months, I have really gone hard into the writings of Catherine Doherty, the founders of Madonna House. I've read 20-ish books or something like that, and really found it super helpful for my own spiritual life and beautiful in that way. And so I am pretty open on my socials, and I've posted, hey, look at this and that, and a bunch of quotes from her. So I had read one or two of her books, Dear Father, which is a book on the priesthood, back when I was in seminary, and found it good, but not amazing. And what happened was a few years ago, I started taking on more Byzantine, Eastern in the sense of Eastern Europe, Orthodox spirituality into my own prayer, in reading, in methods, and things like that. And for various reasons. And I was attracted to Madonna House as kind of a synthesis of East and West. In my own community, we have to do an 8-day retreat, 8 days or more every year. And every second year, it has to be a spiritual exercise with our own community. On the alternate years, you can arrange something else as your retreat. And given that I saw Madonna House as possibly the kind of synthesis of East and West, I felt the attraction. And last summer, so summer of 2024, I went on a 1-week retreat there, and I was really transformed and moved from there. With Madonna House, there's 2 parts. There's Catherine Doherty in the community, a brief explanation of each. Catherine Doherty was a minor Russian noble, not a big nobility family, and she got kicked out by the Bolshevik Revolution around the time of the First World War. She became a traveling speaker around North America, telling stories of old Russia between the wars, turned into very much working for the poor, social justice after World War II, and then, in the 60s, founded this community, mixing East and West, and living a very simple life of prayer and serving the poor. She is a great spiritual author. I would highly recommend reading Catherine Doherty. Probably some of the top books I'd recommend for spiritual reading. And there's 2 or 3 books I'd recommend people start with if they want to know about Catherine Doherty and from the spirituality. If you want to know about her, there's biographies, but if you want to know the spiritual aspect. The first book I'd recommend is her most well-known book, which is called Poustinia, Poustinia, which is giving oneself over to God entirely in time of prayer. A Poustinia is a whole day, but the kind of methodology, the prayer method, can be helpful elsewhere. Secondly, I think Soul of My Soul is the most practical book for the average listener to this podcast, learning about her. And then, if you are a priest, seminarian, or discerning, her book, Dear Father, which is a powerful book on the priesthood and on how we sacrifice, is a great option. The community of Madonna House is a public association of the faithful. It has a few things that don't quite match religious life or Society of Apostolic life, so it's just an association of the faithful. For those of you who know the distinction, it's based in rural Canada, a little northeast of Toronto and northwest of Ottawa, out in the middle of nowhere, basically. They have a number of other houses, mainly dedicated to prayer or serving the poor. It has a very simple, low-tech lifestyle. My community requires me to basically requires me to have a phone that has capacity for WhatsApp, whereas they had cell phones, but they barely didn't have screens. Well, didn't have touch screens and had old-fashioned cell phones way back in the day, if you remember. Finally, 2 notes of gratitude. Eileen C. on Facebook. She said, "Thank you for your perseverance and dedication to this podcast. It's been wonderful having you accompany me through the documents of Vatican II. Thank you also for arranging guest speakers. Their specialized insight into the documents as they were introduced was a huge help in giving context. I appreciate how you shared some of your story and personal anecdotes as well as your own journey through this year." I think that's great, Eileen. Thank you for that. I really put in a lot of effort to try and find a good presenter for each one. I'm not going to tell you who was and who wasn't, but some of them were my first choice and other ones were the 3rd or 4th choice. There's a lot of good people in the church who know a lot on these different topics. David L. on X said, "I liked Vatican II in a year. It's nice to go through church documents with people who know how to explain them. I have more respect for Vatican II." And that's really helpful. Hopefully that helps to have more respect. So a little bit about the podcast, how it worked out. So as of the 15th of December, I'm recording this on the 16th, there were 148,582 downloads. That is about 450 downloads an episode, which is reasonable, not bad. I was hoping to hit 1,000 per episode, but I'm not super disappointed with that. That's decent audience. A little bit about my own experience. I had studied the documents of Vatican II well. My doctoral thesis has a bit on Gaudium et Spes, and I knew some of them really reasonably well like this. And it was good to just review them, explain them to others, and things like that. Other documents I was not as expert on. They were either topics I wasn't as super detailed interested in. I am not a liturgy expert in that sense. I think I'd read Sacrosanctum Concilium in total, but I hadn't gone in depth in a lot of the intermediate parts. Or Christus Dominus on bishops is not read too often. And on those ones, I really learned a bunch as well. I'm glad I could share this podcast with you. I don't know what I'll do in the future. I know for this coming year, I just don't have the time to do a podcast, especially the one this intense where I'm putting out an episode every day. Maybe I'll do a limited run like this again, documents of John Paul II or something, encyclicals of John Paul II, or maybe not, or maybe I'll do a long-term podcast where I just put out an episode a week. I also want to thank Don Bettinelli at SQPN, StarQuest. He was the biggest help setting this all up, doing a lot of the technical behind-the-scenes stuff. You don't see him, but he's been a huge help in making this podcast happen. So thank you for listening to the Vatican II in a year. As I noted before, it would be great to give donations to both StarQuest and to my own community. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help StarQuest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one time, monthly, or join the StarQuest Patreon. I do this podcast on a volunteer basis, and my local religious community relies on donations to pay the bills. If you want to support my community, you can go to patreon.com/frmatthewlc. There's also a link for that and a one-time donation at my own site, frmatthewlc.com. Usually here I'd introduce the next episode, but there will not be a next episode. Thank you for listening to the entire podcast of Vatican II in a year, including this bonus episode.
Amen.